I shouldn't be alive to tell this story. I don't know if it was pure luck or some greater being was looking out for me, but 2 nights ago I almost lost my life to something. I'm an amateur bird watcher, and Long Island, where I live, has a surprising number of different species to observe. I've spent a lot of time in the few county and state parks in the area and have a large catalog of hundreds of specimens I have photographed. My white whale, if you will, is a snowy owl. They typically live in the northern reaches of Canada, but during the winter they migrate south and a few make it to the shores of Long Island. I have been trying for several years to even catch a glimpse of one, but always to no avail. Still, this past weekend I gathered together my gear and planned on exploring a stretch of open beach I'd rarely been to. It was out east, and that part of Long Island is much less populated. I have a mid-tier camera that I use as well as a cheap pair of binoculars from Walmart. I couldn't afford much more. I got to the beach around 9 in the morning, and of course it was completely abandoned. Only weirdos who like birds visit the beach in winter, I guess. I walked for about 2 miles along the beach. Despite not catching sight of my quarry, I was enjoying myself. The cold air and sense of isolation were actually invigorating. I spend most of my days in an overheated office building with constant background chatter all around me. I hit my predetermined hallway mark and decided I should head back now. About 30 minutes away from my car, I decided to take a little rest and just look out over the ocean. I climbed to the top of one of the higher dunes and took a seat. It had only been a few minutes when I saw something odd in the water. I was about 100 yards from the shoreline, and this thing was probably another 100 yards out in the water, so I couldn't really get a good look at it. Whatever it was, it had a long, thin, white body, a stark contrast to the murky blue waters it was swimming through. Again, the distance made it difficult, but I guessed that it was 30 or 40 feet long. Its color ruled out a downed tree, and anyway, it was propelling itself through the water, not floating along with the current. The thought crossed my mind that it might be a sturgeon, but it appeared much larger than even the largest known sturgeons ever caught. I snapped a few pics, but it was so far and the sun was so bright that you wouldn't even be able to make it out in the photos. I decided to head down towards the water to see if I could get a better look. That turned out to be an awful idea. I lost sight of the creature as I climbed down the dune. The higher elevations had given me a better vantage point, and down here on the sand, I was level with the water. As I made my way across the beach heading towards the water, I stopped to try to clean the lens on my camera. Standing still, I could hear an odd sputtering overtop the gentle lapping of the waves. I looked up, and heading straight towards me was the thin white line of the creature, cutting atop the surface of the water like a shark's fin. Watching this thing moving through the water like an arrow was a surreal experience, and I stood transfixed. But I quickly snapped out of it as it hit the shoreline and emerged from the water. It had the head of a snake attached to a long, bony-looking body. The sun glinted off its stark white body as it flashed across the top of the sand. I turned and ran as fast as I could, but beating through the dry sand was an exercise in futility. The thing was moving at twice the speed I could move, and I probably only had another 10 seconds before it was upon me. In a complete panic and not knowing what else to do, I ripped my camera from around my neck and threw it as hard as possible at the creature. I'd never played baseball and was hardly athletic, but something was guiding my throw that day, and the heavy camera slammed right against the creature's face. It reared its head up and began violently shaking it back and forth while the last 10-foot segment of the creature whipped back and forth across the sand, spraying a gritty cloud into the air all about it. I took the opportunity to finish my dash up the dune and ran down to the road after climbing over it. I made steady progress down the road and kept throwing looks over my shoulder. Sure enough, the creature had regained its composure and came bursting over the top of the dune onto the road behind me. It was moving even faster atop the cold pavement and gaining quickly. I had no camera to throw this time and was sure that I only had a few moments to live. The thing that happened next is what truly made me reconsider my agnostic beliefs in a higher power. Hooting like a barking dog, a flash of white erupted from a nearby clump of bushes. A thick body attached to a pair of thick flapping wings rocketed past and over me, right in the direction of the creature. A snowy owl, the same creature I had set out to observe. Looking over my shoulder while running, the snake creature caught sight of the owl and stretched its long body out, snatching the poor owl from mid-flight. I tripped in surprise and sprawled on the ground. I watched as the snake thing, owl in its mouth, slammed its head into the pavement. The owl stopped its frantic flapping and lay still. Then, with a slowness that the creature hadn't yet exhibited, it turned its long body and began a deliberate slither up and over the dune. I didn't go to investigate, instead picking myself up and finishing the run to my car. I beat it out of there quickly and didn't catch sight of the creature again. I know this sounds made up. Even I struggle to believe that it happened. I don't know if that thing was some kind of undiscovered sea snake or something else unnatural. What I do know is that I'll be going to church this Sunday and probably everyone afterward. When I lived in Ohio, I had a job working for the sheriff's department. I remember one of my first duties was patrolling a wooded area. From my understanding, it was one of those tasks no one wanted. So, being young and new, I was given the job. I didn't realize that I was given the grub work till much later in my employment, but hey, it was an interesting experience. As I understood it, the area was known to attract people often up to no good, or doing mischievous business. I had come to think of it as a lover's lane type of area, but it turned out it attracted a much different type of mischief. The night in question was one of those nights. Very warm, but kind of humid. This wasn't unusual for Ohio, but the days had been so hot that the rain didn't even help. It just sort of made everything sticky. So what felt like 8 hours of patrol was actually only 2 hours. Time seemed to stand still that night in particular. Maybe it's because I was feeling a little overworked. The week had been especially long. And this specific night happened to be my Friday. I just really wanted to get home. Sometimes, if the nights were calm, I would park for a while and just relax. This was one of those nights. It was pretty calm. No disruptions other than the uncomfortable feeling of the heat and wet air. So I paused my patrolling and parked. It doesn't sound like the most appropriate thing to do when on duty, meaning park and just relax, but I kind of let myself take the time as a mini mental break. But that's when it happened. I was soon radioed about multiple reports of an unusual green light just up the road from where I was sitting. I thought, of course this would happen. I didn't think anything would come of it, but I hopped into my vehicle and started circling again. I figured the green light might have best been explained by some kids who came to the woods looking for trouble. I circled and circled, but I didn't see anything like a green light. After about an hour or so, I decided to hop out of my vehicle again. I couldn't stand sitting in a car despite the humidity outside. Also, I was so bored at this point, I started flashing my flashlight around in the trees. Maybe I'd spot those kids with their fireworks. I know this story makes me sound very irresponsible or like I wasn't working hard, but I didn't know how else to keep myself from falling asleep. And I was young. Not that that makes a difference. Anyway, I'm shining my flashlight around. I'm looking at some of the trees, and this all gets pretty boring pretty quickly. And so I turned my flashlight off and sat on the hood of my vehicle. I had even started to text friends when I started to hear someone approaching me. I could hear the sound of leaves crunching underfoot and some cracking, as if branches were being broken. I looked up. I didn't see anything. So I put my phone down and I started looking all around. It was very dark, and I was surrounded nearly completely by trees. This excluded the area of the dirt path and a strange makeshift parking area. Really, the parking area was just a rectangular piece of dirt. I still couldn't see anything. If it had been a person, I think I would have seen them. The trees were pretty tall, but the trunks were rather thin. The dense area of the leaves started probably about 12 feet from the ground. So a person should be noticeable, right? And I didn't hear anyone talking or giggling. That made it more bizarre. If it was a group of kids, they'd surely be making a lot of noise, usually laughing with them. But all I heard was a strange movement in the distance. I tried picturing pleasant things because I was starting to get a little freaked out. So a dog in the woods didn't seem very scary. I told myself that's what it was. I keep looking towards the trees, and I noticed that one of the trees appeared to have moved in a strange way, like it was swaying. You know when you're out in the dark, and certain things look much darker than everything else? That's what these trees looked like in the dark. They looked darker than everything else, like a shadow of themselves, if that makes sense. And then I realized that the tree that moved, it no longer looked like a tree. It looked more like a very tall person, as in a 10-foot tall person. It looked like it had shoulders and arms and a neck and all other things like a human would. I told myself I was just hallucinating. The dark can do that to people. It's tricky. But then the shadow moved again, and this time I saw a distinct head. I didn't see a face. I'm just trying to clarify. Just the shadow of where its head would be. How did I know it was its head? Well, I could see its eyes. Its eyes were glowing this strange orange color. I was terrified. What was I to do? What was this thing? I don't have an answer for the last one. But before I could think, I found myself jumping into my patrol car and speeding off towards town. I started thinking about the reports of the green light and how this strange thing was in the woods. Did both incidents stem from each other? Like, did the shadow come from the green light? That wouldn't make much sense, would it? Or maybe it would. I'm not sure what I saw that night. I'm not sure if it was a creature from space or if it was one of those ape monsters that people are always talking about. All I know is it scared a lot of life out of me. Every cop has their share of crazy stories, but this one is definitely the highlight of my career. Back in the 80s, I was an officer in the Bridgeport Police Department. It's an industrial center on the coast of Connecticut. It's not a massive metroplex like Dallas or New York City, but it's big enough to have its share of crime. I worked the north end, up toward the border with Trumbull, in a residential area. Lots of duplexes and triplexes, so there were more families than you'd think based on the housing. The thing about being a neighborhood cop is that, at least back then, we got to know the people. There was always somebody good to give you gossip and a lot of time. That kind of connection helps you keep the peace better than anything the force tells you to do nowadays. My favorite neighbor, actually she was everybody's favorite neighbor, was Mrs. Belinsky. She was a sweet elderly woman in her 80s who owned a triplex in the middle of the block. She didn't have family close by, so everybody looked out for her. Mrs. Belinsky baked the best cookies, which she always had ready for me on Tuesday when I'd stop by. She'd smile and chat, and I'd make sure she didn't need anything before I kept going on my patrol. Fortunately, she lived in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so there weren't many problems. Sure, there was the occasional drunk neighbor, especially on Saturday night, or maybe there was a loud party every once in a while, but I never got a call to go to Mrs. Belinsky's place. Until the night I did. The call didn't come from her. It came from a neighbor. Like I said, everybody loved Mrs. Belinsky and made sure they looked out for her. So when the neighbor lady heard loud arguing coming from the Belinsky house, she called the station. I hadn't clocked out yet, so I came over as fast as I could to do a welfare check. I went in the rattling gate and knocked on the door. I knew it'd take Mrs. Belinsky a while to get to the door, so I made sure I listened for any raised voices, since that's what the neighbor complaint said. When Mrs. Belinsky finally got to the door, she was in her housecoat and carrying her little white poodle. She didn't seem to be in distress, but the dog looked a little agitated. Still, Mrs. Belinsky was surprised to see me. Apparently, she hadn't heard anything. She didn't have tenants at the moment, so she couldn't imagine why her neighbor would say she heard yelling. Since she wasn't in danger and I couldn't hear anything, I asked if I could make a perimeter check of her property to make sure everything was closed up tight. She didn't have a problem with that. I walked around, tapping the windows to make sure none of them were loose and checking the door locks. The front of the house was fine, but the big backyard, overgrown in some spots, made me nervous. It was dark and had some bushes that would make great cover for anyone trying to sneak around. I didn't see any signs that anyone had been there, but there was something about the yard that just made my skin crawl. Still, I didn't see any intruders or signs of trespassers, so I had to report to Mrs. Belinsky that everything was fine. I told her to call if she heard anything, then I left. Everything seemed to go back to normal. I checked in with the neighbor who'd made the initial report, and she hadn't heard anything. I asked casually if she'd seen anything or anyone in the backyard. Turns out her teenage son mowed Mrs. Belinsky's lawn for her, but he never said he saw anything. I chalked it up to a loud TV. Mrs. Belinsky was half deaf and considered the matter closed. Until the next Tuesday night, when a different neighbor called the precinct to report what sounded like a man yelling at Mrs. Belinsky's house. I sped over there, lights and sirens, jerked open the gate and sprinted up the steps. As I pounded on the storm door, the yelling cut off like someone had yanked the plug on it. The hair on the back of my neck was already standing up, and the feeling only got worse as I waited for Mrs. Belinsky to come to the door. When she didn't, well, you don't have to be a cop to realize what was going through my head. By now, some of the neighbors were standing around, hanging at the fence line. I pounded on the door one more time and announced I was the police. Still nothing. I could hear sirens in the distance and knew backup was coming, but I didn't want to wait. Not with the life of one elderly lady potentially hanging in the balance. I kicked open the door and went in. I knew the layout of Mrs. Belinsky's first floor since I'd been there. The front room parlor, where she had all her best furniture, was empty. The doorway opposite me led to the dining room, then the kitchen. I knew she watched her shows in her little sitting room off the dining room. If she was doing her usual thing and just hadn't heard me, I knew she'd be in there. I was listening for any sounds at all, but other than the sounds of the street outside, I didn't hear anything. I moved left, gun drawn and held low and ready, and eased around the corner to peek into the sitting room. Mrs. Belinsky was in her rocking chair, either asleep or unconscious. She didn't appear to be injured, and there were no other signs of an intruder, but that didn't mean I relaxed. Her dog was missing. I holstered my service weapon and tried to wake Mrs. Belinsky up. To say she was surprised to see me was an understatement. Once I explained what had happened, I asked where her poodle was. She didn't know. That bad feeling had never really left, but now it came back with a vengeance. I got Mrs. Belinsky outside with the neighbors and promised I'd look for her dog. I figured if the poodle wasn't with her owner, it probably wasn't on the first floor. I went through the door that led to the second-floor apartment. The layout was similar to Mrs. Belinsky's, with a hallway leading to the third-floor stair in the back. Mrs. Belinsky's apartment was homey and old-fashioned. These untenanted floors were unsettling. Weird. The floors creaked under my weight, but the further into the space I went, the more muffled the sound seemed to be. I almost felt like I was underwater. Everything seemed to come to me slowly. Sound. Thoughts. Everything. But the place was empty. I headed for the stairway to the last apartment. As soon as my shoe touched that steep painted stair, I heard yelling. I couldn't make out what was being said, but there was very clearly an argument. Male and female voices. Training kicked in. I started up the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears. I knew there were 10 stairs. I knew because I counted them. But even though I knew that, I felt like I was climbing them forever. It was like the minutes were being stretched out like taffy by hands I couldn't see, for a reason I didn't understand. Finally, I broke all my training and looked down at each step as I took it, mentally walking myself through the motions of, I'm picking up my foot. I'm placing my foot on the next step. My foot is on the step. I'm moving up. It sounds utterly ridiculous now that I'm writing this, but then it was the only way I could seem to move at all. Then I got to the third-floor landing. The door to the next apartment was right there. I could hear that argument again, but I still couldn't make out what they were saying. I felt like I was hearing everything underwater. I'm ashamed of this, but I broke out in goosebumps. I mean, I wasn't a rookie and this wasn't my first domestic disturbance call, but I also knew there shouldn't be anyone in that apartment to even have a disturbance. I took a deep breath and pounded on the door. Police! I don't have an explanation for what happened next, so I'll just report it. The landing got cold. There was a breeze, cold, but frigid. So cold I could see my breath puffing out, fast and uneven. The landing light came on, even though I wasn't anywhere near the switch, and that somehow made the shadows at the edges of the landing even darker. At that point, all I wanted was to leave, but I couldn't make myself move. I have no idea what I would have done if I hadn't heard a whimper. I almost jumped out of my skin when something touched my leg. It was Mrs. Belinsky's little white poodle, shivering so hard it looked like it was going to shake itself into pieces. I don't know what it was about the dog, but just having it there, knowing I needed to get it back to Mrs. B, who loved it, made me able to move. I scooped up the dog and started hustling down the stairs. I was terrified that it would take just as long to get down them as it had seemed to take to go up, but I felt like I was able to move normally. I didn't breathe right until I got down to Mrs. Belinsky's floor. As soon as the poodle saw her, it squirmed out of my hold and trotted over to the elderly lady who was sitting with a couple of the neighbors. That cold feeling I'd had vanished, and I was left feeling almost silly for being so worried. I don't quite remember how I ended up filling out the incident report on that call, but I'm pretty sure I didn't mention cold spots, odd time distortions, and an argument from people who didn't exist. As for Mrs. Belinsky's little noise problem, well, her neighbors talked her into having her parish priest over, and I guess blessing the house did the trick. Or at least I was never called back there for that kind of disturbance again. There is a state park in Illinois that has a whole slew of hidden canyons, caves, and waterfalls. It's a strange place. You wouldn't think to find anything like it in the area, judging by the surrounding deciduous forests and flat, open fields. The park isn't terribly large either, but it is highly trafficked in the summer months. There is a campground and several cabins in the park that are usually rented out many months in advance. This is where I worked as a park ranger for 6 years. There is a long, tragic history of this park, starting with 2 warring Native American tribes that lived in the area. I won't get into all of that here, but there have been strange happenings in the park since the very start. A lot of people blame it on native ghosts who died on the land, and while there may indeed be ghosts here, there is something else here as well. We would get reports from guests about animals damaging their property in the campgrounds and other strange things, like tents being unzipped in the middle of the night and things moving around. There was one instance where rocks from a fire pit were placed in a circle around the tent of the guest staying there. Even more confounding was the fact that they had put out their fire late in the evening, so the rocks were undoubtedly extremely hot. The complaints we would get from the cabin guests were that something was knocking on the doors, scraping on the walls, and tapping on the window glass. It was all weird but mostly harmless stuff. At least harmless in that no one was physically injured. If someone left anything outside unsecured, though, it could likely be moved. But then it gets weird. First, I should explain to you a little about the layout of the park. There are several canyons. Most of them are box canyons with no way out. You have to hike in and then turn around and hike out. Most of these canyons have waterfalls of some sort. Depending on the season, the waterfalls can range from a steady supply of water to just a trickle. There are usually stagnant pools of water at the base of the canyons. The waters there are a beautiful bluish green. Gorgeous in photos, but I definitely wouldn't go swimming in them. A few times a year we would get reports of hikers seeing creatures in these bluish-green pools or hearing a voice telling them to go in. Often, they would report that it was the voice of someone they knew, but the person wasn't there. It was super weird stuff. There wasn't a whole lot we could tell them, other than not to go into the pools and keep themselves alert. Like I said, it only happened a few times a year, but it did happen year after year. Most of the reports were from the same 3 locations in the park. One particular summer, it was extremely hot and we didn't have much rainfall. The pools were shrinking, but we were getting higher than normal reports from hikers. None of the reports were incredibly detailed. I think it was because people didn't want us to think they were crazy. Most of the time, they would just say they saw something strange in the canyon or on the trail or hear something strange, and let us know that we should probably check it out. After the 5th report that summer, I started doing some digging. I pulled up all the reports for the last 10 years and marked their location on a map. I don't know why no one had dug into this before, but I found that the locations were all relatively close to caves. That was the only thing they had in common. There is a pretty extensive cave system throughout the canyons, but I'm not sure if it has been explored in detail, or at least it hasn't been mapped out recently. Judging from the map, there was a possibility that the caves could be interconnected, but I wasn't certain. There was one canyon, however, that seemed to have the most action, and right next to it were 3 large caves. So one day I made an excuse about needing to head to that area so I could test my theory. I parked my vehicle at the trailhead and hiked in about 6 miles to the first canyon. There were what looked like fish bones along the edge of the pool at the end of the canyon. Now this was rather strange. I didn't think fish would be able to survive in an environment like that. But at least I didn't see any creatures, nor did I hear any strange voices. I set out on my mission to explore inside the caves. I brought a handheld flashlight and a headlamp and a rope to tie to a tree outside the cave so that I wouldn't get lost if the cave had multiple chambers. I headed into the largest cave first. I didn't find anything strange at the entrance, but quickly I realized I had made a huge mistake. I followed the cave for what felt like an eternity, although I'm sure it was only a few minutes. I heard something move in the distance, and I shined my light on it. I couldn't see what it was, but it looked like there was a nest of some sort in the cave. It looked like a bird's nest, but it was so large it could have fit a human. It was lined with fresh leaves and grass. There were bones scattered around the outside of the nest. There were no animals I knew of that made any nests like that. I pulled on the rope to help me find my way back out to find that it was slack. I tried to pull the slack out and it was never ending. I realized then that my rope had been either cut or untied. All of a sudden the air felt thin and it was hard to breathe. I did my best not to panic. I hurried out of the cave as quickly as I could and by some miracle made it outside. I took a quick look around, but I didn't see anything. Yet something out here had released my rope. Sure enough, when I got to the tree where I had tied it, there was nothing there, but something had obviously untied it. I knew I needed to leave. I didn't know what was out there, but I just knew I had to get far away, fast. I turned back to give it all one last look, and that's when I saw it, although only for a moment. It was crouched down near the entrance of the cave, just beyond the light. It looked ghostly. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like a human, but it wasn't a human. It had no hair on its body and was so pale it was nearly pure white, like something that had never seen the sunlight. Its eyes were huge for the size of its head, and I didn't see much of a nose. I ran nearly the entire 6 miles back to the truck, and I never went into that place alone again.